So we're seeing this, right? All right, sounds good. All right. So hi, I'm Regina, and I'm going to start a timer right now. I'm going to be talking about the triumph of Flora, the Floralia festival in Rome, and the goddess Flora in Ovid's Fasti. So before I start, I'm going to put some content warnings out just to make sure that you guys are aware of this. There will be descriptions of rape specifically within Ovidian myth, discussions of rape apologism within Ovidian myth, as well as discussions of violence and prejudice against sex workers within ancient Rome. I will, in the presentation, I will make sure to give these proper warnings again before the specific discussions, but of course, at any time, if you do not feel comfortable, feel free to step out from my talk. Okay, so let's start at the beginning here. This is how Ovid summons Flora in his 5th book of his Fasti. And the Fasti is this fantastical, unfortunately unfinished poem cataloging the festivals of the Roman calendar. So Flora comes to him and appears, with a scent of roses falling behind her, and Ovid entreats her to describe the details of her sacred festival to him. And this is the Floralia. So this festival, and specifically the description of, the festival and Flora within Ovid's Fasti is going to be the discussion of my talk. So my argument is essentially that Ovid's treatment of Flora's story within the Fasti is a commentary not only against strict Augustan moral expectations, but kind of in the same vein, Augustus's repression of free speech. This was sort of very important to Ovid as he was writing in exile. And Ovid does this by framing Flora, she's the patroness of sex workers and kind of the benefactor of this unrestrained Floralia festival. And he pits her against sort of these traditional Augustan state gods, and grants her this sort of unprecedented, unchecked amount of power and speech within his narrative. Obviously, I'm going to begin by saying that Ovid's opinion on Augustus is a very complicated one. Ovidian scholars have spent decades analyzing this, and there's not really any, a lot of conflicting ideas on this. I, for one, kind of view the Fasti as not being necessarily all pro or all anti-Augustan. I think there's some nuance in it, but I think I'm going to say that Flora's specific story within it, I believe, is an anti-Augustan narrative, and I will argue that. So I'm going to return to Augustus in a bit, but for now, I'm going to talk a little bit about Flora and her festival. So, this is actually pretty good timing for this. The Floralia festival is best described as kind of like a spring fertility festival. It's kind of like a proto-May Day, and it takes place at the end of April, so I guess a little later, and kind of at the beginning of May. And it's pretty notorious within Roman history because there was the participation of sex workers within these festivities, not just, attending the festivities, but kind of very much involved in them. The festivities kind of had all the hallmarks of traditional sort of, fertility festivals, but I think the sex workers' involvement in it is sort of like a big intrinsic part of it. As for what exactly they did, we're pretty sure that it has something to sort of do with these sort of naked mime performances, basically. But the point is that they were an essential part and very much associated with the festivities. And another important notable aspect, I think, is that these games were Ovid describes them as having a very markedly plebeian background. So Flora gained her temple and her games, according to Ovid and the Fasti, in the wake of a victory of the plebeians pretty much against wealthy landowners in the 3rd century BCE. This is a real event that happened, but he sort of mythicizes it. And Ovid describes Flora as being, wanting her rights open to the plebs. She's not only a protectress of sex workers within Rome, but she also kind of belongs assuredly to the non-elites. Okay. And all right, Flora is really interesting. There's a lot of art, especially after the Renaissance. They really, really liked her. She's in a lot of artwork. So I'm going to kind of intersperse some paintings of her in between my slides. But okay, so here's my first major trigger warning. I'm going to be describing specifically the rape of Flora and the apologism within the Ovidian myth. So I'm not going to read all of this, but so Ovid basically has Flora come in and narrate her story, kind of the origins of her festival, but also kind of this horrifying, shocking story of how she transforms from the nymph Chloris into the goddess Flora. I'm not going to read all of this, but I kind of bolded the important part of it, which is that she says that Zephyrus, the god of the west wind, he makes good of the rape that he did to her by basically marrying her, and that she has no complaints about about what happened to her. So this is obviously, the description of the assault is obviously very disturbing, but I feel like even more disconcerting is the fact that she makes excuse of her rape. She forgives him because he marries her afterward and kind of grants her godhood. And I think the fact that Flora is the one to recount this and basically approve of her rape is very significant. She's the only female figure in the Fasti who describes the violence perpetrated against her. And there's only a handful of women who actually do it in Ovidian writings in general. So that I feel like is significant. And I feel like it's very tempting to read this description as solely, Ovid excusing rape, and not only of the rape committed against Flora, but kind of in general, because, she's given a very prominent place within the narrative. Like, she gets a voice, and she uses her voice to sort of, excuse what happens to her. And this is a view that I definitely agree with. But I will say that I don't think that that's all that's going on in this narrative, because Flora has a very unique story in this heavily politicized Fasti. I think that there need to look a little bit deeper at it. Now, anyone who has read Richland's seminal piece on reading Ovid's rapes is aware of kind of the evocative imagery of the magician, slicing the woman in the box in half. And she asks, like, why is it a lady in the magician's box? And why do we want to watch this pretended evisceration? So I'm going to own up to the fact that my interpretation of Flora's story does focus more on the magician, Ovid in this context, than it does on the woman, as Richland suggests to do. But like in this concession, I'm going to say that I can also acknowledge that the story doesn't have to be an either or. Flora's story, I think, can be a political commentary, but still enforces these harmful patriarchal stereotypes about rapes and rape survivors. Richland says that footnotes do not cancel content any more than narrative structures do. And I agree with that. The fact that Flora's story acts as an allegory does not erase the disturbing fact that Ovid, for some reason, finds it necessary to write a rape survivor absolving her rapist in order to get his point across. I feel like to ignore that fact would be irresponsible of me. So I want to make sure that I'm getting that point across as I'm talking about this. So with that concession in place, I'm going to turn to my analysis of Flora's depiction in the Fasti, because as I mentioned earlier, her story has a really kind of unique place. Her characterization, her fate, they are markedly different from other women and rape victims within the story. Flora, I would say her story is pretty comparable kind of to that of Proserpina. She has a lot of associations with her actually, and they both do end up marrying their rapists. But Flora is kind of allowed to be the narrator of her own story, while Proserpina's feelings are kind of distanced from the narrative. And Flora, is ascended to godhood, and she gets this kind of immense amount of power, which is kind of unlike others in the Fasti. I mean, Proserpina is pretty much confined to the underworld. Laura and Callisto, they're rendered voiceless and so on. But, Flora gets this power and she gets this voice, which is very different than what we see in other stories within the Fasti. And I think that another consideration is also just the amount of importance that Ovid places on Flora as a member of the pantheon. She's a goddess in Rome who had her own flamen, she had her own, priests and stuff, but she wasn't altogether entirely significant. But in the Fasti, Ovid has Flora brush shoulders with some of the bigger names in the Olympian pantheon. I mean, Juno turns to Flora for help, and Flora, helps her give birth to Mars. Obviously, this is a different story than the original one, but Ovid places Flora in direct comparison with Venus and Vesta and Ceres. These are all very important gods, especially like in Augustan Rome. And by associating Flora with these goddesses, he is kind of commenting on the power of Flora herself. And Flora, goes out to describe her abilities. She basically brought Rome to their knees with a famine because they disregarded her. They refused to, follow her. So Flora is not just a goddess of like the dainty reeds. That's how she describes. She's like, I'm not just a goddess of dainty reeds, but I hold supremacy over fields and over like, the vine and honey. And she has pretty much, he gives her so much more power than I think is originally associated with her. And a final important thing is that Ovid sort of not only relates to the goddess, but like emphasizes his connection with her. He connects his name, Naso, which is nose, with the enjoyment of smelling flowers, Flora, obviously. And he kind of begs her to bless his work so that it can, continue into the future. and almost sort of assigns her a role that makes her like a poet like him in her like herself. Like Flora goes out to describe, oh, I created all of these flowers. I'm the inventor of all of them, and she speaks kind of in terms that invoke originality and creativity and innovation. She is an artist and a poet like Ovid. So all of these aspects are important as to why Ovid is emphasizing her importance. But I think the most significant is that Flora is called upon by Ovid to speak about her own story, and she does speak. She's referred to by some scholars as a chatterbox, and I don't think that's too far from the truth. She gives like a lot of lines to talk about her story, something like 200 or so, and she makes a really big impression on the audience. And the question becomes then, like, so why does Ovid give Flora such a voice, and why does he give her so much attention? And like this is especially when one considers how many of his rape victims are characterized by their voicelessness. And I think obviously one reason can be that he's sort of trying to grant a degree of authority to his skewed view of rape, as I mentioned earlier. And I think that's one thing that's going on here. But also, when you're looking at Flora and the backdrop of this politicized Fasti, which is a poem that is all about the concepts of who has freedom to speak and who, when, and who does, I think that we see like a totally different story coming forward. In the Fasti, we see ramifications of what happened to those who speak out of turn. The goddess Laura has her tongue cut out because she tattles on Jupiter. And Flora does go through violence, but she's not silenced. I mean, she's, in fact, the opposite is true. Like, if the silencing of women within the Fasti is meant to like kind of represent the limits of free speech, especially under Augustan, Rome, and the fact that Flora is so imbued with speech and power is surely significant. And so this issue, of voice and freedom of speech returns to the Augustan backdrop of when the Fasti was composed. So obviously the Fasti was written by Ovid when he was in exile after, decades of Augustan reform in the Roman world, religious changes to the calendar, moral reforms to marriage and procreation and sexuality. And Augustus, I feel like in his later years, kind of began cracking down more on the freedom of speech. He might have been a little laxer earlier on, and obviously we see this most in the case of Ovid, who, his discussion of Augustus's moral discussion, I would say discussion, I don't think it was more of like a condemnation of Augustus's moral reforms, famously landed him in exile. So it's not surprising that we see Ovid bringing this idea to the forefront of the Fasti in issues of liberty and voicelessness. And honestly, like, who is better to embody this spirit, of speech and resistance and in liberty than Flora, who is the protectress of the plebs, and she's the guardian of sex workers, and her festival grants visibility and power to members of society who are like so not often granted a voice. So for my next like trigger content warning, I am going to mention a bit of violence and prejudice against sex workers in ancient Rome. So
15 minutes. Thank you, Regina.
Yes. Okay, I'm wrapping up. Or somewhat wrapping up. All right. So, but under Augustan legislation, sex workers had to give up their legal rights as citizens when they entered their profession. And I say legal rights, but so often to begin with, many of them were slaves. And they couldn't write a will, they couldn't marry. And many of them faced, threats of assault and, rape in everyday lives. If they didn't have protection of like wealthy patrons, they could really do little to protect themselves legally against violence. And I think this quote really says it well, that these laws sort of formalize their denigration. And, they might have not been, it's been argued that they weren't like really physically separated from sort of the wealthy upper class, but, socially, they basically were. They kind of were seen, there were clearly social distinctions between sex workers and the quote unquote respectable Romans in dress and in, the ways that they acted. And, they kind of, their legal status granted them like a degree of invisibility of voicelessness. But the Floralia allowed for the overlooking of these boundaries and the treatment of sex workers, even if it was only for the duration of the festival. It basically, they would be playing out their transgressions of social norms in a way that, would garner applause and laughter, rather than shame. I'm quoting a really good article here. But, I think Ovid would definitely have been aware of the implications of these social transgressions. And that's kind of, and how they, went directly against Augustan moral agendas. And that's why he would have Flora act as this champion, of speech within the Fasti. And, Flora's position within the Fasti is more fitting when you consider, when you consider kind of how she was neglected under Augustus and Augustan-era writers. We see like no mentions of her by any authors, basically other than Ovid. She's left out of Virgil's Georgics, which is kind of unusual considering her agricultural role. Her temple was destroyed in 3 CE along with a bunch of other ones, and it wasn't restored until Tiberius in 17 CE. Augustus, the temple of Magna Mater was destroyed during the same year, and Augustus, notably quickly restored that temple, but not the one of Flora or Liber or Libera, who were all, these were all plebeian cults. And I would say that Flora kind of gets her triumph, so to speak, because we see Ovid emphasizing her importance and interweaving her stories within the deities of Rome. It's Flora who helps birth Mars, who's the father of Rome, and Ovid also kind of places Flora in direct opposition of Vesta in this kind of important section in Book 4. Basically, Ovid, here's the lines. Ovid cedes Flora's space at the end of April to describe this dedication of a temple to Vesta. This was important because this was a specifically Augustan dedication. But Flora kind of reigns victorious because she's afforded so many more lines in Book 5 than Vesta is allowed. It means Vesta gets 6. I couldn't even fit all of the lines that Flora gets. We're interrupting. He's kind of, I would say that Ovid's kind of, by interrupting Flora's joyous games with the dedication of a temple to the Augustan Vesta, he has characterized Vesta as, and I love this description, a chilly killjoy figure for whom he must accommodate. So Ovid has, through the intercession of Flora, reclaimed some of his voice, and he's essentially rewritten the narrative of time by placing a distinctly Ovidian twist on the calendar. And so oh yes, so here, this is how I think that Book 5 played out a little bit. Anyway, so I'll end the discussion by talking about Flora and saying that I don't think that her story was a happy one, but I do think that it kind of had a degree of hopefulness to it. Her triumph is that she kind of goes through this traumatic experience and she survives and still is able to remain and have her voice. And she's not unchanged from this experience. I mean, she goes from Chloris to Flora. I mean, she does change, but in the end, she still persists. And I think that, she does end up sort of following or fulfilling the wish that Ovid asks her before her departure, which is, scatter your gifts, I beg you, over my breast, so that my song may flower forever. And I think that that's basically what she does. I mean, she gives him his speech back and allows, his stories to continue into the future. So I'd say it's not a victory, but it's kind of a triumph. And thank you.